Welcome back, everybody, to the February 24th, 2026 AI update for the AIX Higher Ed podcast. We're doing a briefer update this week and doing it a little bit early because I'm going to be heading to a conference tomorrow and I'm not going to be available later in the week. So we wanted to make sure we got this out there. We'll be able to return with a longer update a little later next week, and then we'll get into the regular routine of things after that.
The big question, of course, that, I guess it's my favorite topic here, AGI, but I think it's a useful kind of overall benchmark in terms of where things are heading. We have a few slides on this. Sam Altman at this, India conference / launch that they had says, hey, AGI is getting pretty close. These models can basically generalize, which we've seen in other places. And superintelligence is probably saying is not that far off. And I think it's because they're starting to see, some AI coding blast off, so to speak, I'll call it. Other people say recursive self-improvement. Those are a little bit different, right? There's difference between the human directing the coding and the machine figuring out what it needs to do. But we're rapidly accelerating both of those a little bit. And, there was an article in Nature that we talked about before where they made a claim of AGI. And yesterday I listened to a podcast with one of the authors who he said is originally kind of a mathematician and then went into machine learning. And he made the claim that it can generalize, right? It can kind of apply what it knows in one area to another, that it's solving math problems that are not in the database. And we're certainly starting to see that. But he also made the claim that it understands what it's doing, at least to a degree. And I thought it was interesting because the host of the podcast now, believes this. So that's probably why she had him on and she was pushing it. But the host said, well, what about your friends? Like your friends in the field, what do they think? And he just said well, it's not really controversial amongst us. Like we think it can generalize and we think it has a degree of awareness, right? He said that does raise ethical issues in terms of how we treat it, how society treats it. But he said that was above his pay grade. But he didn't really even seem to think what he was saying was very controversial, though if you look on social media, it is.
Part of this is just about the generalized discussion about it. If you're looking at people that have been focusing on this for a while and they see the rapid change, it's probably not that surprising. But as we start seeing this seep out through popular media, that's where it's even more surprising and people aren't really sure what to do with it.
Yeah, and then there was another article that was posted on the 20th on LessWrong, and I'll have to put my old glasses on to see all four reasons. So, the author is saying, well, this could be AGI. Maybe this is like a little bit of an early call, but, kind of hang with me. And he says, look, it can think, it can plan to a degree, and it can achieve goals. This is probably maybe not number 4, flexible enough to meaningfully attempt most tasks a human can. But he says it can do a little bit of 4. It might be really expensive to get it to do a lot of those tasks, but says we're pretty close, right? So to me, what's important is seeing more and more people just kind of saying, hey, this is AGI. And they're talking about digital AGI, which doesn't meet some people's definitions, right? They don't think it's necessarily in a physical capacity. But you in our field, education, we're still primarily teaching students how to do knowledge work, which is, in this situation, digital. So that's really what's most relevant here anyhow.
And it's not necessarily about the big philosophical questions. AGI is really also about recognizing the generalizable nature and applications that are going to be coming from it. It's an important sea change that we would see coming.
And then it's just like, are we ready? All these people are saying this, hey, we're not ready. Society's not ready. Education's not ready. I mean, it's hard for me to believe it. Then I see it on social media. There's still debates about writing detectors. Students should be allowed to use a basic chatbot in school, or should we have, professional development about how basic texting chatbots work? And, society's kind of pushing into AGI and potentially large scale labor displacement, and kind of this idea that you're going to interact with this digital entity, which is at least probably seemingly conscious at this point. Are we ready to talk to students about that? I have a student I work with we were talking about AGI today, and, he's a high school student. He's like, yeah, this is AGI. And, he's read a lot about it, and kind of thought a lot about it. So, here you have a 17 or 18-year-old student saying, yeah, we have AGI. So, there's another person it can throw in the basket of people who see the current systems as AGI.
Part of the benefit of being 17 or 18 is that you haven't lived through other technological change that happened at a much slower pace. I think the biggest sticking point for most people is that we're not accustomed to this rate of change. And, we've always had faster rates of change with newer technologies. When we moved to digital media, we moved to email, moved to online, moved to Web 2.0, that each of those changes happened faster and faster. But we're still not ready for the rate of change that's happening here. And that's why if you look at people that have been exposed to it for a while and really inside the discussion of it for the last couple of years, they get it and they can see that we're really reaching that point. Everybody else has a moment of disbelief because it's not possible to see that kind of change given a previous framework or perspective. And that's something we're going to have to, we don't really have time to be patient with, but we are going to have to help people move through that process very quickly to understand what they're getting ready to face.
And, a lot of this is, of course, made possible by coding, huge improvements. We talked about this Claude code can basically go for 14 hours with a 50% chance. I think is what this is saying, that, it's going to need some human intervention, but it's still a long percentage, not percentage of time, a long number of hours, a lot of hours, I guess I should say, before it might need any human intervention. So it's building these systems, right? I mean, there's still the second question of like, well, does the human have to direct it, or does it have to figure out what it needs to build on its own? But we're going to see rapid advancements when the AI can build itself.
And it's not just a matter of extending the amount of time. It's not like it's working slower and taking 14 hours.
Well,
These
right.
models are working much faster. And they're far more efficient, and they're able to continue for that long without losing sight of what they're working on. And once they crack that and it can continue to work, and that's where you see something like OpenClaw being so amazing, because they've worked out systems where it can take notes effectively and then be able to get back on task and be able to continue to check in. That's changing the nature of the kind of work it can do entirely.
And this is just a tweet from one of the people who's working on Codex at OpenAI. He's like, "Oh, I went and I saw, looking at some of our internal models stuff. He's like, this stuff we have now is like, it's basically like, just like a toy." Which is kind of unbelievable because most people think this can, code a lot of the systems that we have, or a lot of the software can basically code all of it. So, I heard about a year ago, maybe not even a year ago, it was over the summer, but I guess about 9 months ago, saying in 2 years we'll be able to just code enterprise systems, right? An enterprise system be like Expedia.com or something, that we're just going to be able to code that through voice. So maybe that's what they have coming out here over the next few months. So I think, and this has come up on another podcast we listened to. It's kind of interesting. It's like, well, are we going to build AGI as humans, or are we going to build the AI, right, that figures out how to kind of take us to the next steps of AGI? Whether we're at AGI now, we talked about that in some ways, but are we able to get like our full planning, longer horizon thinking, more real time learning? In physical AI, is it the AI that's going to figure all that out? And I've heard somebody say like, okay, well, the LLMs, because everybody says the LLMs are not, they are not the end all and the be all. But if they can build the code, and they can figure out what code they need to build to get to AGI, then maybe the humans have already done what we need to do.
The other thing that's really important about this is that even with taking AGI out of the equation, what's really distinctive is that we're getting to the point where we have a partner in the development of new technologies and the development of new knowledge. And that's something we've never really had before. We've had tools, but we're not really working with a tool now. We're building the tools that are going to be partners and will surpass us in important ways, and hopefully be able to encourage us to continue doing important work. But that is a collaboration that we're not really accustomed to, and it provides great opportunity. I think there's tremendous potential there, but we have to really think about it a little differently. And that's a perspective that we have to be ready to share with students.
Yeah, it's almost like as if your AI or your tool, right? First, it's your undergraduate student, then it's your graduate student, right? Then it's your colleague, and then figure out something that make a discovery that you didn't make, right? It kind of become your peer and maybe even a leader. And then I really like how you say that it becomes a partner, because that's really hard for people to get their hands around, right? Then they wouldn't think of an AI as a student who went through that progression. And, it's just kind of beginning to do more and more difficult things that, Gemini Pro 3.1, which came out, we just kind of briefly mentioned it last week, guess it solved a frontier math 4 problem. I wouldn't even have any idea how to tackle that, as you know. But it just kind of keeps escalating. And, we're definitely going to have a math professor on here as a guest to help us unpack some of these math things. But it just shows you kind of like how within a closed loop system, it just keeps accelerating.
And it's not recalling information. I mean, these are examples of being able to do novel work, creative work. There's still some say there's a little bit of gray area trying to understand that, but I think we're well beyond that point, that we have to recognize that these frontier level systems are able to do novel creative work that we just assumed, or many assumed, AI was not going to be capable of doing, at least at this point. And it definitely is. Now, this is something that Anthropic came out with recently, and it was a really fascinating report. And what they did in this AI Fluency Index is that they were looking at some education reports, drawing from what was referred to as the 4D AI Fluency Framework. And it was developed by two professors, Rick Dakin and Joseph Feller, who worked in collaboration with Anthropic. They were looking at 24 specific behaviors. And so what Anthropic did is they went through and they were able to do privacy protected sampling of interactions with Claude. And they did this over a week in January. And they were able to pull a number of these conversations to detect how many of these specific behaviors were actually exhibited when people were interacting with Claude. Now, they really only could focus on 11 of them because they're directly observable. And the other ones are a little more difficult because they aren't as easily observable within a chat. And so they're going to have to think about some other qualitative ways of measuring that. But it was a really interesting finding because they looked at 9,800 different conversations, including a lot of back and forth. And what they were looking for were a number of things like how well somebody iterated and refined the discussion, whether or not they clarified goals before asking for help, setting the interaction mode, communicating style and tone preference, and checking facts and claims that matter. And what was really important about it is that if you go and look at the report, there are some of these categories where people were exhibiting it a great deal, like iteration and refinement of the chat. That was really effective. Or clarifying goal before asking for help, about 51%. Some of the others were really low. Checking facts and claims that matter, that was about 8.7%, or consulting an AI and approach before execution, about 10%. And there's some real concerns raised then about how people are interacting with it. And the results were showing that one of the concerns is that the polished AI outputs were the ones that kind of resulted in people being less careful instead of being more careful. Because when you see something that's that advanced, some people kind of let their guard down thinking, wow, it looks really good. It must be right. And I think we've all experienced that a little bit on our own. And Anthropic is certainly cautioning against that. What they were then going further in the report, talking about iteration and refinement and how important that is in terms of providing examples, clarifying goals, identifying context, specifying format, different questions for reasoning. And that's what they're really trying to promote, is that people will start to engage in that iteration and refinement on a more granular level, a more sophisticated way. And that's something that'll really build toward helping build that AI fluency. And they give some suggestions at the end of the open public report where they talk about some things you can do to build your own AI fluency. Staying in the conversation, and that's the iteration and refinement, going back and forth with the AI, with the bot, whatever it is that you're working with, to really get follow-up questions and to be able to get a sense of how to critically engage with the bot and the results that are coming out. Always question the really polished outputs, because you can get something that looks really good, but that doesn't mean that it is actually good. And the tools are so good at formatting content that we should be suspicious of the polished content as much as we are of the unpolished content that you might have. And then also setting the terms of the collaboration is something they note. And they said that only about 30% of the conversations did this, where the users told Claude how they'd like to interact with them, such as like, push back on me if my assumptions are wrong, or, play devil's advocate, or let's test some of these ideas, or walk me through the reasoning before you give me the answer. Those are the kinds of terms of collaboration they're saying we really need to do. And I think this is a really powerful report. It gives us a framework for thinking about AI fluency in a far more sophisticated way. And they're drawing from the research being done by these professors and doing the kind of study of those interactions on Claude. Limitations to the size of the study. It's only on Claude. It's only on the chatbot of Claude, not through API use. So lots of limitations. And it's only 11 of the 24, but it's a good starting point. It sets a good foundation, kind of a good benchmark to see what we can measure against in the future. And for all of us in education, this is really important because we should be working on this with our students to talk about these components of AI fluency. How can we encourage students to really think critically, to question the output, and to set the expectations in the format of the conversation? They're going to get a lot more out of it if we do that.
And one thing we're still seeing. There's an article in the Washington Post today. Of course, Gary Marcus, picked up on it. Right, just said that companies were struggling, to integrate AI to take full advantage of it. And I think that's pretty well known at this point, right? Like there's all things, generally that have to be done. You have to get your data in order, and it has to work. You got to look at your own processes. Human elements, of adoption, building it into your workflows. It's all a bit complicated. Unlike, and it's kind of hard to argue against Gary Marcus in some ways, incredibly well qualified. That doesn't mean that, AI is not going to make it. The way I see it is that the companies don't get the AI integrated, they're probably not going to make it. They're not going to be able to compete with AI native businesses. And OpenAI, we saw today saying, I guess right now about 60% of their business is consumer and 40% is business, and they kind of expect that to kind of invert. But they're starting to work with some of the big consultancies. And, some of the consultancies, they're focused more on this idea of like, how do you integrate it into the workflow? How do you do the people adaptation? That's your McKinsey and others. And then they have a couple more technical consultancies that are going to go in and help the companies with the technical integration. But the companies, there's high demand for this, right? To get the AI to work. They see it as a cost saving measure, and of course, maybe just better marketing and all types of things. But there is, and they're calling this the Frontier Alliance. That OpenAI has set up with these. So I don't think this is any indication that AI is dead. It's just, these are legacy companies, right? With legacy workflows, that some people say needed disrupted anyhow. And we started seeing some disruption in workflows, even just as AI was, starting to hit the scene. But I just think we're going to see a lot more integration. And like I say, I think companies that don't integrate it are probably going to be replaced.
This is where we get into the aspect of AI integration that is more based on the humanities and humanistic work, because we're really thinking about the way these structures are socially constructed, and it's not as based on the technology. There was a really interesting post by Marta Shehu from George Mason recently where she was talking about how that disruption is likely to occur, more likely to happen in a company or in a field where there is a really well-documented case of the kind of work that's being done. And so when you see it in computer science, you see it in the sciences, there's a lot that's been very carefully documented. It's a little easier to be able to test the output. When you get into something that's based on more qualitative assessment, that's a little more challenging, not only for the integration of the AI, but also for the acceptance of the AI to understand how it's going to be working. These are natural adoption challenges. We've seen this with other adoptions of technologies in the past. It's not surprising, and I think overreading it as this means it's failing is really not the proper read on it. It just shows that maybe there's some other thoughtful work that needs to be done to consider what's going to be done with it. It also might provide a really important opportunity for us to be thoughtful about its application and what can be done with it, rather than just heading in at full speed. Maybe there's a way to talk about that, and that's something we should be talking about in our classrooms too.
And this slide just kind of combined, the privacy and the robotics. But there's interesting privacy. There's a new study out that people talk. Oh, we just put this little data like into the into the LLM. You have a conversation with it. You think is innocuous. It picks up a little thing. But just kind of based on like a handful of comments that you make, it can infer where you live, what you do, and what your interests are. That's pretty incredible. There's one element of this that's obviously kind of privacy related, how much it knows about you. And I think people kind of don't really even fully understand, even before generative AI, how much these like, Google and the like kind of knew about us, and, data they sold. So to me, that always kind of creates a backdrop through which I don't worry about it as much. But these are incredibly powerful. And it also kind of, people like, oh, OpenAI, like, how are they going to make it? There's like selling ads, like, they're not worth that much. I mean, they have like, what, 800 million people on their platform. And they basically probably, if they can figure out just from a little bit of information, a lot about you, that means they probably know a lot about all or nearly all of those 800 people. Which is kind of a marketing marketing bonanza. But so privacy, and then robotics. We have a lot of stuff coming out. NVIDIA released a new training model to make it easier to train robots. Figure that's a big U.S. company. They have their robots working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Without really even any breaks, they just go and they insert a new battery once their one battery gets low. So there's a tweet there from Brad Adcock. You could see it on my blog talking about how they have them working 24/7 in the drone warfare in the Ukraine, and I put in a little video of that too on the blog. And you think of drones as always like being in the things in the sky, but they show there's drone tanks. They just have tanks rolling around without anybody in the tank. Little like army vehicles and shooter systems, all kind of stuff, kind of rolling through the Ukraine. And they said that this is one of the 20 main drone development companies in the Ukraine. And we know like Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, is working with them. And I'm sure the U.S., as much as we hem and haw about backing the Ukraine, I'm sure we love learning about all these robotic happenings on the battlefield, because it's clearly the future of warfare.
But getting to a question of what to study, it's certainly confusing out there. Many of us are still trying to figure out how do we integrate it in our classroom. So many campuses are, as we've noted, are several steps behind. Here's some quotes from some of the industry leaders. Uber CEO saying, "You need to work hard. We have time to adapt, but unemployment's going to spike. And so, how do we get ahead of that for our students?" I think we've mentioned before, Daniela Amade, co-founder of Anthropic, has said the importance of studying the humanities. It's not just STEM, it's focusing on uniquely human skills, as we've been talking about during this episode. And of course, her brother Dario is talking about character education. Maybe it's time for us to not focus so much just on job preparation, but also in building character, not just technical skills, because that's going to be important as we start thinking about interaction with AI and leadership in an AI world where AI is able to take over a lot of the work. It's going to be a very different kind of interaction, different society, and we need to be thoughtful about how we prepare students for that.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things. Sam Altman, who'll always say, do something you love and learn how to use the tools so you can apply this intelligence. And it's going to get easier. You're not going to need it doesn't seem like, I'll say it this way, it doesn't seem like you're going to need as much technical knowledge, right? Even just thinking about where you're saying back to coding, you're just going to be able to command the systems. But even now, where you might need a little more technical knowledge, it's still getting used to that idea of working with a non-human intelligence, right? And you were talking about that earlier, to see, basically, if you think about it, see your computer as a partner, right? Rather than just kind of a machine that you're operating. Yeah, an incredibly intelligent partner, maybe the one that's more intelligent than yourself, which is also difficult for people to swallow, right? And we're seeing that with some of the people in math, right? These really accomplished mathematicians saying, "Oh, well, it's able to solve this problem that, like, I don't think any human would have been able to solve, or maybe if I did it, I might have been able to do it, but it would have taken me weeks," right? So, but they're kind of seeing, all right, I get to work with this hyper intelligent AI, just if maybe they got to work with, their friend who was also like a leading mathematician all day, kind of working on some challenges. So they definitely see it as collaborative. But I think that's another thing, we got to think about. Like, I don't want to make any definitive claims, right? But the last few years, or at least right before AI, was all STEM, STEM, STEM. You've got to learn STEM, STEM, STEM. And, there's still probably some value to learning the basic concepts, but it seems that you're going to be able to command the AI to do a lot of it. There's even some discussion of like, well, which jobs are going to get replaced at like OpenAI and Anthropic, or are the first people to go? And they're like, well, the engineers, they're not going to need they're not going to need as many engineers. So those are really, Anthropic and OpenAI are hiring the very top engineers in their field, paying people millions of dollars, right?
Yeah, but
And
I push back on this a little bit, Stefan,
yeah,
because I think you're right. They aren't going to need engineers the way they needed engineers before. But if you look at somebody like Boris Cherny, who developed Claude code, and he's no longer coding, he coded Claude code, and then he used Claude code to do. He's noted that he hasn't written any code in
right.
months himself. So I think they're all going to be shifting to very different roles. Will they need as many in those new roles? Maybe not. But I think we have to all get our head around the idea that if we just view it as a loss of current jobs, yeah, most of them are going to be gone because they're going to be replaced by new versions of many of those jobs. And I'm not totally convinced that the AI is going to be doing all of the work and that we're just going to hand it over and say, yeah, we're happy with the output. I think what'll probably happen is that we're going to find some equilibrium in between where there's still going to be a demand for humans to be contributing and doing a lot of work in different kinds of work and being far more productive than they ever were before. Now, we might get to a point further on where many of them are just replaced. I think that I'm not sure that we're going to really get to that point or what point we get to that point. But in the interim, there are going to be a lot of differences made to the jobs that we have. I just think it's going to be totally different. It is going to be disruptive. There is going to be high unemployment, but that doesn't mean they aren't going to need people. They're just going to need people that are ready to do very different things. That's what we have to prepare our students for.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of the trick, right? Because it's going to be very higher order, right? They almost say like you're going to skip like the lower rungs of the ladder. Yeah, I agree. Like Boris is safe, right? It's kind of a question of like, well, how many layers down on a Boris? How safe are those people? Can those people transition? Can those people quickly become a Boris, even if it's not an Anthropic, even if it's somewhere else, or maybe some other entrepreneurship, activity. Would that would be sufficient, right? Knowledge of kind of what they have. But yeah, I think that's kind of where I agree with you that that's kind of where the shakeup would occur. And I think part of it is like, it's just hard because there's a lot of unknowns. Um, a lot of unknowns where things are.
Well, thanks for joining us this week. Slightly shorter version. It's still about half an hour, but stay tuned. We'll have a full update returning next week, and keep following on Stefan's blog to be able to get more in-depth.